he said, and began to read aloud. Down in a wine vault under the city, 2 old men were sitting. They were drinking booze. Torn were their garments, hair and beards were gritty. One had an overcoat, but hardly any shoes. Overhead, the streetcars through the streets were running, filled with happy people going home to Christmas. In the Adirondacks the hunters all were gunning. Big ships were sailing down by the isthmus. In came a little tot for to kiss her granny. Such a little totty, she could scarcely toddle, saying, "Kiss me, Grandpa, kiss your little Nanny." But the old man beaned her with a whiskey bottle. Outside the snowflakes began for to flutter. Far at sea the ships were sailing with seamen. Not another word did Angel Nanny utter. Her grandsire chuckled and pledged the whiskey demon. Up spake the second man, he was worn and weary. Tears washed his face, which otherwise was pasty. She loved her parents, who commuted on the Erie. Brother, I'm afraid you struck a trifle hasty. She came to see you, all her pretty duds on, bringing Christmas posies for her mother's garden, riding in the tunnel underneath the Hudson. Brother, was it rum caused your heart to harden? What on earth is there funny in that? Said Mrs. Mifflin. Poor little lamb, I think it was terrible. There's more of it, cried Roger, opening his mouth to continue. No more, thank you, said Helen. There ought to be a fine for using the meter of Love in the Valley that way. I'm going out to market, so if the bell rings, you'll have to answer it. Roger added the Archie scrapbook to Miss Titania's shelf and went on browsing over the volumes he had collected. The nigger of Narcissus, he said to himself, for even if she doesn't read the story, perhaps she'll read the preface, which not marble nor the monuments of princes will outlive. Dickens' Christmas stories to introduce her to Mrs. Lirriper, the queen of landladies. Publishers tell me that Norfolk Street, Strand, is best known for the famous literary agent that has his office there, but I wonder how many of them know that that was where Mrs. Lirriper had her immortal lodgings. The notebooks of Samuel Butler, just to give her a little intellectual jazz. The Wrong Box, because it's the best farce in the language. Travels with a Donkey, to show her what good writing is like. The 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, to give her a sense of pity for human woes. Wait a minute, though. That's a pretty broad book for young ladies. I guess we'll put it aside and see what else there is. Some of Mr. Mosher's catalogues. Fine. They'll show her the true spirit of what one book lover calls biblio bliss. Walking stick papers. Yes, there are still good essayists running around. A bound file of the Publishers' Weekly to give her a smack of trade matters. Joe's Boys in case she needs a little relaxation. The Lays of Ancient Rome and Austin Dobson to show her some good poetry. I wonder if they give them the Lays to read in school nowadays. I have a horrible fear they are brought up on the Battle of Salome and the brutal redcoats of '76. And now we'll be exceptionally subtle. We'll stick in a Robert Chambers to see if she falls for it. He viewed the shelf with pride. Not bad, he said to himself. I'll just add this Leonard Merrick, Whispers About Women, to amuse her. I bet that title will start her guessing. Helen will say I ought to have included the Bible, but I'll omit it on purpose, just to see whether the girl misses it. With typical male curiosity, he pulled out the bureau drawers to see what disposition his wife had made of them, and was pleased to find a little muslin bag of lavender dispersing a quiet fragrance in each. Very nice, he remarked, very nice indeed. About the only thing missing is an ashtray. If Miss Titania is as modern as some of them, that'll be the first thing she'll call for. And maybe a copy of Ezra Pound's poems. I do hope she's not what Helen calls a Bolshevixen. There was nothing Bolshevik about a glittering limousine that drew up at the corner of Gissing and Swinburne Streets early that afternoon. A chauffeur in green livery opened the door, lifted out a suitcase of beautiful brown leather, and gave a respectful hand to the vision that emerged from the depths of lilac-colored upholstery. "Where do you want me to carry the bag, miss?" "This is the bitter parting," replied Miss Titania. "I don't want you to know my address, Edwards. Some of my mad friends might worm it out of you, and I don't want them coming down and bothering me. I'm going to be very busy with literature. I'll walk the rest of the way." Edward saluted with a grin. He worshipped the original young heiress, and returned to his wheel. "There's one thing I want you to do for me," said Titania. "Call up my father and tell him I'm on the job." "Yes, miss," said Edwards, who would have run the limousine into a government motor truck if she had ordered it. Miss Chapman's small gloved hand descended into an interesting purse that was cuffed to her wrist with a bright little chain. She drew out a nickel. It was characteristic of her that it was a very bright and engaging-looking nickel, and handed it gravely to her charioteer. Equally gravely he saluted, and the car, after moving through certain dignified arcs, swam swiftly away down Thackeray Boulevard. Titania, after making sure that Edwards was out of sight, turned up Gissing Street with a fluent pace and an observant eye. A small boy cried, "Carry your bag, lady?" and she was about to agree, but then remembered that she was now engaged at $10 a week, and waved him away. Our readers would feel a justifiable grudge if we did not attempt a description of the young lady, and we will employ the few blocks of her course along Gissing Street for this purpose. Walking behind her, the observer, by the time she had reached Clemens Place, would have seen that she was faultlessly tailored in genial tweeds, that her small brown boots were sheltered by spats of that pale tan complexion exhibited by Pullman porters on the Pennsylvania Railroad, that her person was both slender and vigorous, that her shoulders were carrying a sumptuous fur of the color described by the trade as nutria, or possibly opal smoke. The word chinchilla would have occurred irresistibly to this observer from behind. He might also, if he were the father of a family, have had a fleeting vision of many autographed stubs in a checkbook. The general impression that he would have retained, had he turned aside at Clemens Place, would be expensive, but worth the expense. It is more likely, however, that the student of phenomena would have continued along Gissing Street to the next corner, being that of Hazlitt Street. Taking advantage of opportunity, he would overtake the lady on the pavement, with a secret sidelong glance. If he were wise, he would pass her on the right side, where her tilted bonnet permitted a wider angle of vision. He would catch a glimpse of cheek and chin belonging to the category known, and rightly, as adorable, hair that held sunlight through the dullest day, even a small platinum wrist-watch that might pardonably be excused in its exhilarating career for beating a trifle fast. Among the grayish furs he would note a bunch of such violets as never bloom in the crude springtime, but reserve themselves for November and the plate-glass windows of Fifth Avenue. It is probable that whatever the errand of this spectator, he would have continued along Gissing Street a few paces farther. Then, with calculated innocence, he would have halted halfway up the block that leads to the Wordsworth Avenue L, and looked backward with carefully simulated irresolution, as though considering some forgotten matter. With apparently unseeing eyes, he would have scanned the bright pedestrian, and caught the full impact of her rich blue gaze. He would have seen a small, resolute face, rather vivacious in effect, yet with a quaint pathos of youth and eagerness. He would have noted the cheeks lit with excitement and rapid movement in the bracing air. He would certainly have noted the delicate contrast of the fur of the wild nutria with the soft V of her bare throat. Then, to his surprise, he would have seen this attractive person stop, examine her surroundings, and run down some steps into a rather dingy-looking second-hand bookshop. He would have gone about his affairs with a new and surprised conviction that the Almighty had the borough of Brooklyn under his especial care. Roger, who had conceived a notion of some rather peevish foundling of the Ritz-Carlton lobbies and the Central Park riding academies, was agreeably amazed by the sweet simplicity of the young lady. "Is this Mr. Mifflin?" she said, as he advanced all agog from his smoky corner. "Miss Chapman?" he replied, taking her bag. "Helen!" he called. "Miss Titania is here." She looked about the somber alcoves of the shop. "I do think it's adorable of you to take me in," she said. "Dad has told me so much about you. He says I'm impossible. I suppose this is the literature he talks about. I want to know all about it. And here's Bock!" she cried. "Dad says he's the greatest dog in the world, named after Botticelli or somebody. I've brought him a present. It's in my bag. Nice old Bocky." Bock, who was unaccustomed to spats, was examining them after his own fashion. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Mifflin, "we are delighted to see you. I hope you'll be happy with us, but I rather doubt it. Mr. Mifflin is a hard man to get along with." "Oh, I'm sure of it!" cried Titania. I mean, I'm sure I shall be happy. You mustn't believe a word of what Dad says about me. I'm crazy about books. I don't see how you can bear to sell them. I brought these violets for you, Mrs. Mifflin." "How perfectly sweet of you," said Helen, captivated already. "Come along. We'll put them right in water. I'll show you to your room." Roger heard them moving about overhead. It suddenly occurred to him that the shop was rather a dingy place for a young girl. "I wish I had thought to get in a cash register," he mused. "She'll think I'm terribly unbusinesslike." "Now," said Mrs. Mifflin, as she and Titania came downstairs again, "I'm making some pastry, so I'm going to turn you over to your employer. He can show you round the shop and tell you where all the books are." "Before we begin," said Titania, "just let me give Bock his present." She showed a large package of tissue paper, and unwinding innumerable layers, finally disclosed a stalwart bone. "I was lunching at Sherry's, and I made the head waiter give me this. He was awfully amused. Come along into the kitchen and give it to him.